Hey, since I'm on holiday in Alsace, I thought it would be good to do a video about an actual wine region. And being here is great because I could show you some things instead of just talking about them. We'll talk a little bit about why the region makes great wine, so a bit about geography and topography. I'll talk about some of the wines and the grapes in those wines and maybe give a few recommendations so you could get into the game of Alsatian wine. First, on geography and topography. The reason why Alsace is a great wine producing region is location. If you look behind me, this is the mountain range of the Vosges. And the mountains protect the region from the weather. It creates a very dry climate. Although Alsace is considered to be a bit of a cooler climate, we are a bit north in the range of where wine can be produced. We're in the very east of France on the border with Germany. As a matter of fact, the region of Alsace was French and then German, and then after World War I it went back to France, and then the Nazis took it back, and then after World War II it went back to France. We're in a great region to produce. The mountains protect from the weather. It creates a long growing season. It can be warm, particularly like now in the summertime. And also if you look at the slopes, they take advantage of these sloped areas of the vineyards. They have a Grand Cru type of system, a bit like Burgundy, and a lot of the best crus are going to be on these slopes. Slopes are important when you're in a northerly or far southerly, southern hemisphere producing area, because it tilts the vines towards the angle of incidence of the sun, and you'll get much riper grapes on a very sloped terrain. So you will see they will describe the terroirs in Alsace. The soils are important. There's everything from limestone, granite, marl, some gravelly stones that hold in the warmth. And it makes for a great area to produce, in particularly white wines, similar to the type of varieties from Germany that you would see, and even the type of bottle that they use in Alsace, same as the German flute, some similar varietals, similar styles, but a warmer producing range. Range of the weather throughout the year allows for riper grapes. The one drawback to the flute is if you have one of these nice wine fridges, you often cannot close the door of the wine fridge because the flute is too long, and a lot of wine storage is made for a Bordeaux style of bottle. My first thought on continuing this video about Alsace was to simply grab some bottles of wine and show you types of wine and grapes and producers and this type of stuff. But I was thinking it could be a good time to talk a little bit more about the structure of wine. What I mean by structure is basically every way we describe wine other than talking about how it tastes or how it smells. So this is typically the sugar level, the alcohol level, the acidity level, the body, and the level of tannin in the wine. And this is important if you're trying to learn to blind taste wines. One of the reasons is if you try to taste blind taste wines only based on the aromas and the flavors of the wine, all wines smell and taste like fruit and wood and spice. And you don't get the differentiation with the flavors that really allows you to pinpoint what is this wine. If you really learn the structure, here is where you could really come much closer faster to pinpointing what is this wine. So I'm going to talk about the sugar level in wine specifically. And the reason being that it plays particularly with Alsace and the types of wines in Alsace. So first talking a bit about how grapes are grown. So you will start with a vine. The vine will produce fruit. Fruit is a grape, and that grape becomes ripe, hopefully through the growing season, depending on how the weather is and where you are. It varies quite a bit with how ripe that grape gets. But in general, if we look at sugar in the grapes, plotted against time, it will start at 0 and it will grow to something. And we have, at the point that we pick the grape, we have a certain amount of sugar and sweetness in the grape. Just think about You taste a piece of fruit, regardless of what fruit that is. If it's unripe fruit, it has a very acidic and tart taste. And if it is a ripe fruit, it has more of a soft and round and a sweet taste to it. So we now have a grape with concentrated sugars in the grape. The grape is picked at some point in time, and they then take it into the winery where they're going to produce wine. And you just do a few basic things, and it varies a bit, whether it's a white wine or a red wine, but you basically smash up the grape, and then there will be some yeast that will attack the juice. It will actually attack the sugars in the juice that is made from that grape. Where does the yeast come from? A few places. Could be the outside of the skin of the grape. It could be simply the air in the vineyard and also in the cellar. And also producers could add yeast to their wine to trigger this conversion. Conversion of sugar into alcohol by yeast. And if we then look at another plot, and what's an interesting thing, some places where it's very hot, in Spain, for example, they have to pick the grapes at night because they don't want the grapes to start to ferment while they're picking the grapes. It could actually happen if it's super hot that as soon as you pick these grapes, you're trying to get them into some bin and get it into the winery to be processed, and they will start to ferment outside in the vineyard, and this is not what you want. So they will even pick them at night at this point in time. The yeast is in the air, the environment is so warm that it will spontaneously start to ferment once you pick it. Now that we have all the grapes crushed into some must, a fluid in the vineyard, you will put it into some sort of tank. There are various types of tanks, and I will draw another graph, because what starts to happen is as the yeast attacks the sugar, it will convert sugar into alcohol. And we have a curve that will look like an X, where the amount of sugar goes down and the amount of alcohol goes up. And this is really a key thing into determining the sugar levels, so the dryness of wine. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking right now that you really love these dry wines. This is a common thing that people say, and I will try and convert you a bit to try some wines that are not so dry. I also thought the same thing before I started to study wine, and find that there's so much more out there with more richness and body to the wines that might have a bit of sugar in the wine. So how do we end up with a sweet wine in the end? Well, one way is to add sweetener to the wine. Not using the actual process itself, but they add something called rectified concentrated grape must, and this can enhance or add to the sweetness of the wine. But there are two more natural ways to do it within the fermentation process. One is that you start with a grape that the sugar concentration is so high that the fermentation process will end and still leave some sugar in the wine. These grapes are typically, they're high in sugar because the length of the growing season is quite long. They might call it something like a late harvest wine. Grapes are on the vine until October, November timeframe, and they're just gathering more and more sugar, and you have a lot of concentrated sugar in that grape. Another way is to stop the fermentation process. So you could simply remove the yeast by filtering it out at some point in time. The difference with these two is the ones where it's highly concentrated in the grapes and you simply kind of run out on the fermentation process, they will be higher in alcohol because you have fully gone through the fermentation process and still left sugar behind. The other ones will typically be lower in alcohol, so maybe something like 11%, could even be 8%, 9%, depending on the type of wine. So these are three different ways that you can go. The more natural ones are more what is sought out in wine. but this can give you a spectrum. So what happens in a dry wine is there is no residual sugar left behind. 100% of that sugar is consumed by the yeast, and then you're left with a dry wine, and then you can go through various processes or points in time to stop the fermentation and end up with a different level of dryness in the wine. Let's talk about a couple wines from Alsace. Let's start with one that has a bit of a sweeter profile, typically to it. I always have to say typically because you could really go full range with the second wine that I'm about to show. So first wine is a Gewürztraminer. This wine, I'll tell you right now, if you haven't had this wine, it will probably have a bit of a strange taste to you. I was with one friend at a wine bar with like 50 wines there, and he said, I want that wine to try, and it was a Gewürztraminer. He took one sip and did not like the wine. What is strange about Gewürztraminer? It has a very tropical palate to it, even lychee, they describe it as. It's a bit of a soft wine. The acidity is not high. It tends to be a bit sweet. What they do in Alsace, if you could see this, they give you an indication on a scale of the dryness of the wine. It's not a scientific scale. It's how the winemaker thinks you will perceive the wine. This Gewürztraminer is in the middle of the dry to sweet scale. In this case, you can get a Grand Cru. If you go and look back at some of my other videos about Burgundy, I talked a bit about the Cru system. You'll see that because this is from Eichberg. Eichberg is the Cru, Kunzbach is the producer, and this is a Gewürztraminer. It is from Alsace. It is good to use with very spicy foods, Thai food, curries, stuff like this, because the sweetness of the wine will help to kind of tone down the spice. If you drink a very dry, acidic wine, it tends to amplify the spiciness from what you were eating. Let's look at another wine. And this is one that can be anything. So you really have to get to know this wine. This is a Riesling. This is also a Grand Cru, also from the same Cru. If you look at the back, this is very close to dry, bone dry on the scale. Riesling can be all things. It can be extremely dry. It can be extremely sweet. It will typically be acidic all the time, especially if you get a German Riesling up to the north. It's cooler. In Alsace, they will still be acidic, but not as acidic as something from Germany. This is a great wine, or it can be a great wine in many different forms. It can age for a tremendously long period of time. If you're still not ready to take the jump and start drinking sweet wines and you say, I love dry wines, Riesling, great dry wine. If you love dry Sauvignon Blanc, please try a dry Riesling. I swear it's much better and more dynamic than Sauvignon Blanc. Maybe we come to that in a future video. This one is 14% alcohol, probably because the sugar level has been completely consumed to make it a dry wine. If you look back at that Gewürztraminer, it was 13.5, and part of the reason could be is that the fermentation process was stopped to leave some residual sugar to create the sweetness in the wine. So this is a bit on Alsace, on a couple of the key wines from the region. If you're up for spicy foods and up for trying something new and strange, definitely recommend go check out a Gewürztraminer. I think they're fairly consistent. So you don't need to think too much. You could stop at a wine shop and ask them what they have or what they would recommend, especially in the States. I find that Gewürztraminers are all a bit similar to each other. With the Riesling, you have to be careful. Check and make sure, because it could be extremely sweet or extremely dry. So make sure you get what you're looking for. I hope you learned a bit about structure of wine, about sweetness of wine, and most of all, I hope you're willing to try some wines that are a bit more sweet than what you normally have. One thing to mention also with Alsace, a couple special wines. If you see something called Vendange Tardive, this is a late harvest wine. It will be very sweet. This is a dessert wine. not to be paired with a normal main course of food, but could go very well with sweet desserts and also with certain types of cheese. I think Vendange Tardive is very Alsace specific. So please go try some sweet wines. Let me know if you find something that you like. I'm always looking for suggestions of new sweet wines. Thanks.